Now we come to a very interesting part of John chapter 1 where Jesus begins to draw his first disciples from the movement of John the Baptist. First, let's start by reading the text. The next day again, John was standing with two of his disciples, and he looked at Jesus as he passed by and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." The two disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. Jesus turned and saw them following and said to them, "What are you seeking?" And they said to him, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" He said to them, "Come and you will see." So they came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day, for it was about the 10th hour. One of the two who heard John speak and followed Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which means Christ. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which means Peter. The next day Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, and said of him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus said to him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered him, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened, and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." Now that we've read the whole section, let's slow down and take it piece by piece and notice some things. It begins in verse 35. The next day again, John was standing with two of his disciples. That is, he had the day where Jesus came up and the Spirit descended upon him. And then now there's a second day, and he's standing here with two of these disciples. One of them is going to remain anonymous and is likely the author of this gospel, and the other one is Andrew. We'll unpack that a little bit more in a moment. Verse 36. And he looked at Jesus as he passed by and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." Now, when he says that he passed by, you need to read a lot into this, or rather pull a lot out of it. There are a lot of connotations here. We have talked about how John wants to present Jesus surpassing the Baptist as a major motif in this gospel. He's emphasizing this because he wants to take the followers of the Baptists in the area around Ephesus and bring them into the church. So when Jesus passes John by, this is not a mere statement about movements and locations. This means that Jesus has surpassed John in terms of the ministry. This is further reflected by the fulfilled typology here. Elisha surpassing Elijah. There are many elements of this story that are recurring here with Jesus and the Baptist from 2 Kings. They both were standing by the Jordan, that is Elijah and Elisha. And Elisha is about to supersede Elijah, and it's at the Jordan River, the same place where Jesus is superseding the Baptist. Then Elijah took his cloak and rolled it up and struck the water, and the water was parted to the one side and to the other, till the two of them could go over on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you." And Elijah said, "Please let there be a double portion of your spirit on me." And he said, "You have asked a hard thing, yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if you do not see me, it shall not be so." And as they still went on and talked, behold, chariots of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven, and Elisha saw it. So Elisha supersedes Elijah, and it is here that Elisha will be anointed with a double portion of Elijah's spirit. And it is represented by something coming down from heaven. Elijah's chariot of fire takes him away, and his cloak descends, signifying the anointing of Elisha here at the Jordan River. What's interesting, because the Spirit has just come down and anointed Jesus in the presence of John the Baptist. So you have the same geography, you have one person surpassing another, and you specifically have this aspect of anointing, which is represented by something coming down from heaven. Both of these stories have this, and we're surely meant to see Jesus as being the fulfillment of Elijah, the prophet, with the greater portion of God's Spirit. Jesus turned and saw them following and said to them, "What are you seeking?" And they said to him, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" In many dramas, the first words of a character are essential. And if you watch my first video, you know that much of this gospel plays out like something that is reminiscent of the Greek theater in the city of Ephesus, where the gospel is written. Jesus asked them a question that confronts every person. What are you looking for? Or as I have it in the translation above, what are you seeking? This question will be asked again and again because this is all about motives. John wants to probe the motives of our heart when we go to follow Jesus. Are we actually seeking Jesus, or are we just seeking some temporary benefits from Jesus? Think of the crowds in John chapter 6 who come to Jesus not because they really desire him, not because they want to really explore his identity, but because they want more miraculous bread. They want him to continuously multiply the loaves of bread and the fish so that they can have free food. And Jesus begins to say very offensive things to them that turn them away. Jesus is constantly asking this question. The gospel writer is meaning to ask his audience this question. What are you looking for? Are you actually looking for Jesus, or are you just looking for some sort of temporary benefits from Jesus? Now, seeking or looking, searching, this is a key word in this gospel. We want to pay attention to it again and again. This is the first thing that Jesus asks about. He wants to ask about your motives. What are you looking for in life? But this other word, when they ask him, where are you staying? The Greek word translated as stay, meno, is theologically significant in John, elsewhere translated as remain. Jesus uses this verb to denote his intimate relationship with the Father, into which he calls his disciples. In other words, these two disciples, they responded with the right question. Jesus wants to know what they're seeking, and they say, we want to know where you are staying. We want to know where you remain so that we can go and be with you. That's the correct motive. That's the correct answer. And so their discipleship will begin. And this notion that one must stay, that one must remain with Jesus, will be very significant in this gospel as these disciples stay and remain with Jesus throughout his ministry. And then when you get to chapter 14 and the following, we see that this is kind of transposed over to the Spirit. Jesus says he is going to leave, but we can still abide with him. We can still remain with him even though he's in heaven by receiving his Spirit. All of this is leading up to the doctrine of the Holy Spirit, that when you believe and you submit to the gospel and you receive the Holy Spirit, that now you remain with Jesus wherever he is, even though he's in heaven. You abide with him through the Spirit. So seeking and remaining, key words that will follow this storyline for the duration of the gospel. He said to them, "Come and you will see." So they came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day. Here's that word, meno, stay or remain. They're doing the right thing. They are remaining with Jesus. For it was about the 10th hour. Now, this isn't the 10th hour Roman time, which would be 10 in the morning. This is Jewish time. So this would be about 4 in the afternoon, too late for them to leave and go somewhere else. So they just simply remain with Jesus. We have talked about wisdom. Wisdom who was there with God at the beginning of the world, and God's wisdom has been personified as a woman through whom God made the world. This is in Proverbs, this is in extra biblical Jewish literature. And it's interesting how John consistently portrays Jesus as being the incarnation of God's wisdom that was with him in the beginning. Listen here to the words of wisdom in Ben Sira. Draw near to me, you who are uneducated, and lodge in the house of instruction. Acquire wisdom for yourselves without money. Put your neck under her yoke, and let your souls receive instruction. It is to be found close by. See with your own eyes. Now, this is what Jesus is saying. Come and see. Wisdom To really know wisdom, it's something you have to pursue for yourself. And Jesus is taking on this language in order to really know Jesus, to really see Jesus. Bible studies are good and learning is good. And obviously, I think very highly of biblical learning. That's why I'm doing this. But to really see Jesus, you kind of have to come and see him experientially. It's experimental. You have to see him for yourself. And so here we have the voice of wisdom speaking through Jesus. One of the two who heard John speak and followed Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which means Christ. Two disciples come out of the movement of John the Baptist, and they come and follow Jesus. And one of them is named Andrew, and the other one remains anonymous. And this is unusual because every other disciple in this chapter is going to have a name. We're going to learn something about him. But this guy, even though he's such a huge figure because he's one of the first two to come and follow Jesus, we never learn his name here. Now, some interpreters have said this means this is the author, that the anonymity is intentional, and it may indicate that he is the one who's later on is going to be called the beloved disciple. And we have kind of a progression then here, that the author shows up in the story and he's simply anonymous. Well, later on in the story, we'll learn that he's the disciple whom Jesus loved, and then finally at the end, we'll learn that he is in fact the author. Well, why is there this progression? Why does he start out anonymous and then only at the end do you find out that he is the author? Well, there could be a number of reasons for that. It could be that he has to build up his credentials first before he tells you that he's the author. And he would have to do that, for example, if he were not one of the 12. If the guy who is the eyewitness to Jesus' life here and is close to Jesus, if he's writing this gospel, but he thinks people won't take him very seriously because he's one of the 12, well, he may start out as just being an anonymous figure and then over the course of the story build up his credentials and then finally let you know that he is in fact the writer. Now, everyone doesn't buy that. Some folks like Keener say, well, how could a guy be so close to Jesus if he was not one of the 12? I don't know. It's kind of difficult to make out why John, son of Zebedee, would start out anonymous in this book and never reveal his name, just call himself the one that Jesus loved. Nevertheless, I do agree with interpreters who say that this anonymous disciple is the author. I think so. And here are some of the reasons for this. Witherington says, in favor of this suggestion is the fact that the fourth evangelist portrays Peter as turning and noticing the beloved disciple, following behind in John chapter 21, the last chapter, which is very similar to the language used here. I've discussed in other lessons how ancients used inclusios, either to mark off an entire book or sections within a book. Things that show up at the beginning of a section will show up at the end. Things that show up at the beginning of a book will show up at the end. And at the end, we have the author, the beloved disciple. He is following behind Jesus, and this leads to an interaction with Peter. And here we have at the beginning of the book this anonymous disciple following Jesus, and then immediately we have an interaction with Peter. The same thing that happens at the beginning of the book is going to happen at the very end. And since this person is the author in this last scene, he's likely the author in this first scene as well. In John 15:27, it says, "And you also will bear witness, because you have been with me from the beginning." Now, this author takes a lot of time to show you that he's sort of the ideal witness, that he's sort of the most qualified person to write a gospel. And in chapter 15, he records for us how important it is that these major witnesses have been with Jesus since the beginning. Well, it makes sense that he would say that if he's this disciple who came with Andrew to follow Jesus at the very beginning. It would be strange if this anonymous disciple is not the author, and then the author goes on to talk about how important it was to be present at the beginning. And so the author likely is one of these two, and that would make him the anonymous disciple. Finally, this would make the beloved disciple a witness to Peter. Notice the we. So Andrew goes to Simon, and he's got this anonymous disciple with him, and he says, "We have found the Messiah, the Messiah, me and this other guy that's standing with me." And this, in some sense, would make This certainly would mean that the author followed Jesus before Peter, and that he is in some sense a witness to Peter. Now, that fits what we find throughout this gospel. The author goes out of his way to let you know that he has edged out Peter, that he is a little more awesome than Peter at certain points. We're going to talk more about that here in just a moment, but there are multiple examples of the author letting you know that when it comes to witnessing, he's just a little bit more qualified than Peter. Now, he's still going to affirm the authority of Peter in the church. We'll see that again. We'll come back to this in a few minutes. But when you look at all these things, it certainly would make sense that this anonymous disciple who was present at the beginning is, in fact, going to be the author of the book. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of John. You should be called Cephas," which means Peter. We want to note here that this is different than the conventions of the rabbis. Rabbis did not pick their disciples. Disciples pick their rabbi, much the way today, you kind of pick what seminary you would like to attend. Jesus is doing something different here. He is picking his disciples, and in doing so, he reflects his deity. Think of all the stories in the Old Testament where God chooses someone for a job. That's what Jesus is doing here. Now, a lot of folks have been concerned by the discrepancies between the Peter and Andrew calling in the Synoptic Gospels versus this one here. Now, I want to show you the difference. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus is passing along the Sea of Galilee. He saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. So Andrew and Peter are together at the sea, and Jesus comes and recruits them both himself. Well, in John's Gospel, Andrew is with the anonymous disciple under John the Baptist. John the Baptist sees Jesus and he says, "That's the Lamb of God." And Andrew and the anonymous disciple go and follow Jesus. And then later, Andrew and the anonymous disciple get Peter to come and join the crew. And folks have wondered, why is this different? Some have gone so far in their attempts to harmonize it that they say there are two different callings, that there's sort of an initial calling where Jesus comes and gets them at the sea, and then later when things really get serious, we have the calling in John's Gospel. Those type of harmonizations, as I will try to explain throughout this process, are not very good. You end up with a Jesus who has a very strange life where he never is allowed to do one thing just one time, that his life is full of all these duplicates, and people can get really silly with these harmonizations. So how do we explain the differences? How big of a deal is it? Is it problematic that the calling stories are different in some of their chronology and details? How do scholars explain these differences? I want to quote two scholars that I think make very relevant observations. Klink says, "The fourth gospel emphasizes the Baptist witness to Jesus, through which the first disciples attached themselves to Jesus. It is the witness of John that directs the disciples to Jesus. The synoptics, however, depict Jesus less as the recipient and more as the initiator, calling the disciples to himself." So this gospel is going to make a big deal out of witnessing, that if you want to bring people into the church, if some people are going to come and follow Jesus, we have to witness. We have to tell people about Jesus. And for the sake of communicating this point, John has rounded off some of the details. He depicts John the Baptist as witnessing to the first disciples about Jesus. And they in turn go and they witness to Peter. And there's sort of this chain reaction that Christianity is a social contagion, specifically because people are willing to witness. Now, your overall details are still the same. Peter and Andrew come to follow Jesus early on in Jesus' ministry, as in the Synoptic Gospels, but there are definitely some details that are different, specifically for the purpose of emphasizing the value of witnessing. Now, is this an issue? Should we worry about this, that there are some different details between the Gospels here? Well, no, I don't think so at all, because as New Testament scholars know, historians in the ancient world recorded history different than we do. Sometimes they would paraphrase, sometimes they would interpret, sometimes for the sake of communicating something that is true, something that is important, uh, details would not be strictly historical the way that a journalist in the modern period would write something down. We don't want to take modern ideas of history and journalism and push them back on these ancient writers. Now, that doesn't mean that John is just going to make up stuff willy nilly. There is an overall consistency between him and the synoptics on this point, but there are definitely some details being changed here for the sake of emphasizing how important it is to be a witness to Christ. And in our time, it makes me think of those who suggest that you don't really need to tell people about Jesus. If you just live it, and if you're just obedient, you're kind, and you're a do-gooder, and all these things, well, then that is your voice of witness. Well, not so. All right. Christianity will always be a message to be proclaimed and believed. We get our word gospel from Isaiah 52. How beautiful are the feet of those who come on the mountain proclaiming good news. And it's the good news through the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 that brings the new creation of Isaiah 54 and the new covenant of Isaiah 55. And there are all these important things, but it all begins with the voice of proclamation in Isaiah 52. Not every Christian is called to be a teacher or a preacher within the assembly, but we're all called to be a witness in our daily life, on the job, in school, wherever you are, at social events. I mean, if you're not witnessing to Jesus, you are definitely not doing your job. Witherington, he says the fourth evangelist has moved this tradition to this point because it is his purpose to say something up front about who Jesus truly was, and at the same time, who the first disciples were. This is a dramatically effective move, especially if the audience of this narrative was not primarily Christians, who already knew the prime movers of the faith, who knew who they were and needed no such explanations. Witherington is suggesting that this gospel is not just written to teach Christians, but it's written to recruit Jews out of the synagogue into the church, and also to recruit those who are still following John the Baptist, who have not made the transition over to following Jesus. We know from the book of Acts that there were a lot of people like that who still had the teachings of the Baptist, but for many years did not come to follow Jesus. And so Witherington's saying, look, these guys need to know who the major players in the early Jesus movement are, even though in the Synoptics, Simon isn't renamed Peter until later in the story. We're going to do that up front. We're going to do all these things because we need these unbelievers to understand from the get-go who these people are, who are the personalities that constituted the early Jesus movement. And for the sake of reaching out to unbelievers and bringing them into the church, some things that happen later in the story are going to be moved to the front, and some details might get paraphrased for the sake of evangelism. Now, again, if John has done this, this is okay. We don't need to look at the differences between him and the synoptics and get really worried because we have contradictions. We don't have contradictions. We have theological truths that are being communicated through paraphrase, and we have necessary movement of details and chronology for the sake of recruiting unbelievers into the church. John has taken some license in this area, and that is totally okay. This brings us to another controversy. What happened to Peter's confession? Matthew chapter 16 says, Simon Peter replied, You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And so Jesus renames Simon to be Peter in this scene. But it's only after Peter hits him with a big confession, which is here left out, which wouldn't be that scandalous except for the following reasons. In this context, the Baptist calls Jesus Lamb of God, Andrew calls him Messiah, Philip calls him the one of whom Moses and the law and the prophets wrote, Nathanael calls him Son of God and King of Israel, and Peter has no grand confession at all. Is this intentional? We have the Synoptic Gospels where Peter makes the grand confession, the confession that outweighs everybody. Well, now they all come to follow Jesus here, and everybody except Peter has a confession. What is going on here? Keener makes an observation here. Others have often proposed that the fourth gospel plays down Peter, or perhaps more accurately treats him and the other disciples ambiguously, whether to play up sectarian Johannine Christianity against apostolic Christianity. What he means by that is some have suggested that in early Christianity you had the Christians who followed John and the Christians who followed Peter, and that they were in a struggle against one another. John's Christians said, well, no, we're right because we follow John. Peter's Christians said, no, we're right because we follow Peter. Now, some people have said that the reason this gospel kind of plays down Peter and plays up John is to show that, John has more authority than Peter, and those who follow John's teachings are right, and those who follow Peter's teachings are wrong. Some have taken that this way. He continues, or more likely, to demonstrate that Peter does not truly outrank an ordinary faithful disciple. For Simon's brother Andrew to confess Jesus as Messiah before Peter does, so may indicate some desire to set the record straight by putting Peter in his place. Now, I do not fully agree with this. I do realize that there has been this controversy over whether or not early apostolic Christianity was truly unified under a common hierarchy with Peter at the top. You read the Synoptic Gospels, and Peter is Jesus' rock. In Matthew, it states that he's given the keys to the kingdom. Definitely Petrine, definitely pro Peter in the Synoptic Gospels. And then you get over to Galatians in chapter 2, and Paul beats up on Peter pretty good for the duration of a chapter. And he has a very disregarding attitude toward Peter's status in the church. He says that Peter stood self-condemned because he was on the wrong side of the line on the question of Jews having table fellowship with Gentiles. And by the time you're done reading that, you get the sense that if Paul has diminished the way that you see Peter, he's okay with that. He's trying to knock Peter down a notch. And for Catholics, this has been problematic, of course, because Peter is supposed to be the head cheese and the beginning of the papacy. For Protestants, it's been problematic because they want to imagine um, early apostolic Christianity as being unified and the New Testament as being unified. And if we have some New Testament documents like the Synoptics, which are pro-Peter, and then we have documents like Galatians, which seem kind of to be anti-Peter, well, then the New Testament doesn't seem to be as unified as many Protestants would like. And so Protestants and Catholics have addressed the issue in Galatians in different ways. Well, some have taken John's gospel and rolled it right in there with Galatians and said that, this author, 5 or 6 times, John outshines Peter, or he's in the right, or think of the resurrection story. John and Peter are both running to the tomb, but John gets there first. Think of the night that Jesus is betrayed. John has to get Peter in because John has connections. He knows the priests, and so he gets Peter in. Or at the Last Supper, Peter tells John, hey, ask him who's the one who's going to betray him. He can't ask him himself because John is closer to Jesus. He's sitting up against his breast, a position that Peter does not have. And many people have read all this and they said, this document is kind of like Galatians. It's trying to knock Peter down a notch. Now, I don't actually believe that. And I explained this in an earlier lesson, but I want to say a little bit more about it here that I didn't say there. This gospel begins by saying that Peter is Jesus' rock, that Simon got renamed as Peter, which means the rock. And then at the end of the gospel, Jesus tells Peter to feed my sheep, a statement that he is, the chief under shepherd of the church. He has authority. None of the other apostles are treated this way. We have Peter's authority affirmed in the first chapter when he is called the rock. We have Peter's authority affirmed in the last chapter when he is the shepherd that feeds Jesus' sheep. Now, for this gospel to begin and end by affirming by affirming Peter's authority, I don't think that we can take all these scenes to mean that John is anti-Peter in some sort of a big sense. And even here, all these confessions and to say, well, Peter's confession got left out and the other disciples have a confession, I think that's being read incorrectly too by a lot of people. What we have here is the other disciples are confessing something about Jesus, But Jesus is confessing something about Peter. They call Jesus all these things: Son of God, Messiah, the one about whom the Moses and the prophets wrote, etc. And all the while, Jesus turns to Peter and says, "You are the rock," right? You see, this is not an anti-Peter passage. I think this is a pro-Peter passage. When everybody's given a title to Jesus, but Jesus is giving a title to Peter, this is good for Peter. This is not bad for Peter. And one more thing. Later on in chapter 6, I'm going to have a lesson where I talk about mathematics and spiritual numbers used in this gospel. And it's interesting, the last chapter of this gospel is used to tell you the jobs of Peter and the author, John. And what are their jobs in the church? John's job is going to be the chief witness. It's his job uh, to tell you things about Jesus because he has all this insider access, all this insider information. Even more than Peter. He tells us that over and over again. When it comes to being a witness, he's even more qualified than Peter. But when it comes to authority in the church, he affirms Peter. And that's what's going on here. John is a more qualified witness, but Peter is a more qualified leader. That's what John is trying to tell us. But in that last chapter, which are about John and Peter, it's interesting. In Hebrew, the value of John's name is 129. And the author will incorporate this number into the final chapter in a very interesting and intelligent way in order to sign off, to say, hey, I'm the guy who wrote this. My name is John. I'm incorporating the number of my name, 129. But he doesn't just incorporate the number of his name. Peter's name in Hebrew has a value of 466. He's also going to incorporate the number 466 as a way of tipping his hat to Peter. Now, I don't think that this author begins his gospel by saying Peter's the rock, ends it by saying he's a shepherd, and includes the numerical value of Peter's name, 466, because this is an anti-Peter document or because this is meant to knock Peter down a notch. This is a pro-Peter document. Yes, John wants you to know that when it comes to insider information and being able to be a witness to the events of Jesus' life, he's more qualified than anybody, even Peter. But this doesn't mean he's anti-Peter. He is pro-Peter, like the Synoptic Gospels, and he tries very hard in his own way to affirm the headship of Peter in Jesus' church. The next day and we don't know if this he is Jesus or Andrew, that's the big debate, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The next day he decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. The he may be Andrew. Now, most translations and interpreters will say the he here is Jesus, but Witherington thinks that the he is Andrew. He says it's a conjecture supported by the fact that everyone else who comes to Jesus in this narrative does so not because Jesus sought them out, but because of someone else's witness. I am inclined to accept this view, he says. And it certainly is true that, you know, everyone else comes into the faith here due to the witness of some other Christian. But the Greek here, you can see here, for those of you who know Greek, etheleison, there's no name. You know, he is built right into the verb. So it can go either way. But I'm not inclined to agree with Witherington on this. I'm going to go with the majority. Because when the next scene begins, Jesus is in Galilee. And so when it says here, the next day he decided to go to Galilee, well, that can't be, you know, Andrew apart from Jesus. Jesus had to go into Galilee. So it makes sense here that that's who this would be. Also, the he could be Jesus since he is the antecedent. He is the last person to act when in the previous verse he renamed Peter. So when we say he here, well, it makes sense that it'd be the last guy who's been doing the actions. So it would be Jesus. So I'm going to agree with the majority here against Witherington and say that the he who is active here is Jesus. It's not Andrew. So the disciples have been seeking Jesus, and Jesus is seeking the disciples. So we find in this scene a combination. Guys going to find Jesus, and they're reaching him through the witness of other disciples. But here we find that Jesus is actively seeking the disciples. We get this picture of synergy. God seeks us while we seek him. There's this element of participation. Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Just want to show you this on a map. Bethsaida, there just north of the Sea of Galilee. These other towns where he did a lot of ministry, Chorazin and Capernaum, just there to the west. We can see much further west, Cana, where Jesus will turn the water to wine in the next chapter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Now, when he calls him Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph, and never records the virgin birth in Bethlehem, many have said that the author of our fourth gospel is either ignorant of the virgin birth or he is opposed to the virgin birth. Now, the second idea, that he's opposed to it, that would require a lot of evidence. He doesn't ever say anything remotely coming close to saying the virgin birth isn't true. He just doesn't mention it. And so, most people have gravitated toward the former idea, that he's just ignorant of the virgin birth. And I'm not in agreement with this. Jesus' status as Joseph's son is attested in the Synoptic tradition, where it can be linked with Joseph's Davidic heritage. In other words, Joseph is the descendant of David, and Jesus is the legal son of Joseph, despite whatever the actual circumstances of his birth might be. He's the legal descendant of Joseph, and therefore the legal descendant of David. And this occurs in Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke are the ones that tell us about the virgin birth, and they're still happy to say that Jesus is the son of Joseph. And so when John says he's the son of Joseph, you don't need to say that he's denying the virgin birth, because the other gospel writers that talk about the virgin birth use the same language. The virgin birth is a pre-Lucan and pre-Matthean tradition, so it is widely known by John's writing. Even though John doesn't explicitly talk about it, it makes sense that he would know about it. In fact, he probably doesn't need to say anything about it, because both he and his audience know this tradition, that Jesus is born of a virgin. Matthew and Luke record the virgin birth, and they're written around 70 AD. Well, John is written in the middle of the 90s, most likely, during the time of Emperor Domitian. And so by this time, the virgin birth tradition is all over the place. Everybody in the Mediterranean who knows something about Jesus probably knows this. And so whether it's mentioned or not, you don't think, oh, he just doesn't know about it. No, no, no. Of course he knows about it. This has been widely disseminated by the time you get to the end of the first century. There are places in this gospel where John knows something and the audience knows something, and then so what you know, you're supposed to take and scrutinize the crowds. The crowds that protest against Jesus, they don't know what John and his audience know, and this makes the crowds look very foolish. Here's an example of this. The people said, "Surely this man is the prophet." Others said, "He is the Messiah." Still others asked, "How can the Messiah come from Galilee? Does not Scripture say that the Messiah will come from David's descendants and from Bethlehem, the town where David lived?" Now, why would John show the crowds, saying something very silly, protesting against Jesus coming from Galilee, saying, well, he's supposed to come from Bethlehem? Well, it's probably because the author knows he comes from Bethlehem, and he knows his readers know this. And so he can kind of make fun of the crowds, if I could say it like that, because they don't know this. And so they're saying, oh, he can't be the Messiah, he's not from Bethlehem. But John knows he's from Bethlehem because he knows the virgin birth tradition, as everyone would have by this time, late in the first century. And so don't buy that John doesn't know about the virgin birth just because he doesn't explicitly talk about it. We can see lots of reasons to believe that John is assuming the virgin birth is true, and he's assuming his audience knows something about it. Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Why is Nathanael so sarcastic about the town of Nazareth, which you can see pictured here on the screen? What is wrong with Nazareth in his view? I mean, after all, Nathanael is also from the region of Galilee. Perhaps his animosity is born out of a prophet from one's own country mentality. I live in Lubbock, Texas, the home of Texas Tech University, and a lot of people around here are very proud of Texas Tech for whatever reason. And if I were to tell one of them, hey, a president is going to be born here, somebody born here in Lubbock, Texas, who goes to Texas Tech University is going to end up being the president, people wouldn't believe that. Even though people have a lot of pride in Texas Tech around here, still sometimes it's hard for people to believe that, We expect the president to go to a greater school than Texas Tech and to come from a different town than Lubbock. It may be something like that. People have a hard time believing good things can come out of their own region. It could have to do with civic rivalry, from civic rivalry in the region, which was common in antiquity. Nazareth might have uh, be in competition with Capernaum. I mean, there are economic competitions between towns, and even though Nathanael's from this region, he might identify with another town that is in competition with Galilee. That could be it. Whatever the case may be, in John's gospel, it foreshadows the Pharisees' negative evaluation of Jesus' geographic roots. We talked about that a moment ago, how there's a lot of folks who won't give Jesus a chance because they know where he's from. And we see here this starts very early. But Nathanael, unlike them, is at least willing to meet Jesus with an open mind, a mind that is open to persuasion. Honest skepticism about Jesus on the part of one who's really seeking truth is okay. It's dishonest skepticism that is not okay. To evaluate Jesus and Christianity and the gospel critically, but you were never really willing to give it a chance. That's what's not okay. And John is showing us here the honest skepticism, open minded skepticism, this is okay. God can work with that. But stubborn skepticism, the sort that crosses its arms and says, you'll never persuade me, there's not much you can do with that. Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, and said of him, Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit. What does this mean? Well, what we're going to find is Nathanael is a better version of Jacob. Jacob is the Old Testament character who is renamed Israel. And so this is why Jesus is saying an Israelite. He's going to say he's like Jacob. He's a true Israelite, but he's better than Jacob. Jacob was deceitful. But he says this is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. I'll give you an example of some of Jacob's more famous deceitful behaviors, though I won't record them all. Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted. And Jacob said, Sell me your birthright now. And Esau said, I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me? So he weasels Esau out of his birthright by threatening to withhold food that he needs in order to survive. Later, Jacob takes away Esau's blessing. Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. Obviously, that's not true. I've done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game so that your soul may bless me. Well, he ends up blessing him. And then his father's going to find out that I've blessed the wrong son. I've been deceived. And so later in verse 35, he tells Esau, Your brother came deceitfully. And the word used here for deceit is the same one that Jesus uses when he says, You're an Israelite, only you have no deceit. Esau said, Is he not rightly named Jacob, which means deceiver or supplanter? And you have other examples, like when Jacob is with Laban and he's shepherding the flocks, how he deceives him there. And so he's the first Israelite, but he's full of deceit. Well, Jesus is trying to reconstitute Israel. This is why he has 12 apostles to head up the Israel reconstituted as the church. And he wants a better Israel. He wants an Israel without deceit. Uh, Jesus' opponents are seen as deceitful, but not his followers. And he says, look, you have honest skepticism. You're a true Israelite, but you're not like Jacob. You're not deceitful. I like the way Osborne puts it when he's talking about Jacob. He says, later, after he successfully wrestled God, the Lord renamed him Israel, giving him the name that would depict the nation itself. Here, Nathanael is called a true or genuine Israelite, an Israelite who is not like the old Jacob, filled with deceit, but like the new Israel, a man who strives with God, the meaning of the word Israel, and is completely trustworthy. In other words, this is an Israel with all that Jacob removed. Nathanael is a model disciple, completely honest and reliable. Nathanael said to him, How do you know me? Jesus answered him, Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. This has been a text of intense debate. What does this mean when you were under the fig tree? I saw you. Some passages depict the Messianic age as being one where you sit under the fig tree? He shall judge between many peoples, and shall decide disputes for strong nations far away. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. And so it could be that Nathanael had been sitting under a fig tree earlier in the day, and Jesus knows that, and he's revealing that he knows that. And he says, not only were you sitting under a fig tree, in the Messianic age, if you follow me, you will sit under the fig tree in the big sense, in the sense that is told by the prophet Micah. Some have connected it to the story of Adam and Eve when they fell in the garden. Genesis 3:7, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. The Genesis theme has been running throughout John's gospel so far. Right? The serpent deceives, but Nathanael is a man without deceit. He's different from the serpent. Adam and Eve hide from God's sight with fig leaves, but Nathanael was sitting under the fig tree. So it's hard to say if there's a connection here or what it might mean, but Nathanael could be a better Jacob and a better Adam, and better than the serpent as well, and that he pursues the fig tree of the Messianic age, not the fig leaves of shame associated with the fall. Some think that John is trying to make a comparison with one of the stories in the Apocrypha, Daniel and Susanna in the Greek Old Testament, where two older men see a young woman bathing, and they say, look, you better sleep with us, or we're going to accuse you of sleeping with some young man. And she doesn't submit, and so they try to bring an accusation against her, but Daniel has wisdom, and he says, well, let's examine each one of these witnesses separately and ask under which tree did she have sex with this man. And they can't agree whenever they're scrutinized separately. It shows Daniel's wisdom because he gets her off of the hook, and she goes free, and these two men are condemned. So the idea might be that Jesus, by contrast, had actually seen Nathanael under a fig tree, because Jesus, like Nathanael, is honest. He's a reliable witness. He's not like the men in this story. Now, I don't know why Keener is so prone on this. I don't see this as being a very likely connection. The best explanation for can anything good come out of Nazareth is that the word Nazareth derives from a word that means branch in Hebrew, N-Z-R, or Nun Zion Resh in Hebrew, and it's a messianic title. One of the branch passages in Zechariah, where the Messiah is the branch, it also has a reference to sitting under the fig tree. So, Zechariah, now listen, Joshua the high priest, you and your friends who are sitting in front of you, indeed, they are men who are a symbol. For behold, I am going to bring in my servant the branch. This is a messianic text for early Christians. For behold, on the stone that I have set before Joshua, on a single stone with 7 eyes, I will engrave its inscription, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will remove the iniquity of this land in a single day. In that day, declares the Lord of hosts, every one of you will invite his neighbor to come under his vine and under his fig tree. So what's happening here? Well, there's a little thing happening in Hebrew between the word Nazareth and the word branch. Remember, branch is a title for the Messiah here in the book of Zechariah. So what good thing can come out of Nazareth? Nazareth is NZR, Nun Zion Resh in Hebrew. Right? What good thing can come out of NZR? Well, Jesus walks up to him and alludes to a passage that has this same Hebrew word, NZR, only here it is the branch. It's the Messiah, the one who brings in the age where everyone comes under the fig tree. And he realizes what's going on. This is why he goes, whoa, you're the Son of God. You're the King of Israel. Because Jesus wasn't there to hear Nathanael's sarcasm. What good thing can come out of Nazareth, out of the town that is named NZR? Well, Jesus comes up and he starts quoting this passage, which has NZR in it, the branch, the Messiah, who brings you under the vine and under his fig tree. And this blows Nathanael's mind, that not only Jesus knows about the sarcastic question about Nazareth, but how Jesus was able to tie this into the Old Testament passage for which Nazareth was probably named. They probably named Nazareth after the branch in this passage about the Messiah. So Jesus makes this connection. It's really incredible, and this persuades Nathanael that he's the Messiah. Nathanael answered him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel. Just a quick point here. He's likely not thinking of the second person of the Trinity. It's way too early in the game for that. He's thinking of this prophecy. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. It's the Son of David, the Messiah, who is going to be also God's son. And so he's saying, yes, you're the one who fulfills this prophecy. You're going to be like Solomon, but better than Solomon. You're going to be the king of Israel, the son of David, who brings in the Messianic age. Jesus answered him, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these. Now, this raises the question, is Nathanael one of the 12? Because he does not show up in the synoptic tradition. At least the name Nathanael doesn't. Who on earth is Nathanael? Well, many believe he is the disciple called Bartholomew. And so that would make him one of the 12. And the reason they think that is because Bartholomew is coupled with Philip whenever the disciples are listed together. And we look here in John, it's Philip who brought Nathanael into the kingdom. And so he could be this guy that the synoptics know as Bartholomew. And this makes sense because Bartholomew actually means son of Ptolemy. And so there's room for a first name, right? Like we say Simon, son of John. We don't just say son of John. We say Simon, son of John. And so if he's being called the son of Ptolemy in the synoptics, there's still room for a first name, Nathanael. And so he could be one of the 12, but this is conjecture. We're not really sure. Whatever the case may be. In 150, Jesus says he will see greater things. This is likely a reference to him coming with him to turn the water to wine at Cana. And he said to him, Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Remember earlier, he told Nathanael, You are an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. And he's talking about Genesis 27, where Jacob is a deceiver who becomes an Israelite, the first Israelite. But Nathanael's different. He's an Israelite, but unlike Jacob, he has no deceit. He's a better version of Jacob. Well, look what he says here, that you're going to see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. That's exactly what Jacob got to see. He got to see when he was at Bethel, the ladder that connected heaven and earth. So Jesus is continuing this theme that Nathanael is a new and better version of Jacob. When he mentions Bethel, which means house of God, this is pointing ahead to the temple theme of this gospel. The temple was the house of God. It's the place that connects heaven and earth, much like a ladder connecting heaven and earth. And that's what we're going to have in the next chapter, this notion that Jesus is the temple. He is the place where heaven and earth come together, just like the temple, because heaven connects with earth within the person of Jesus. He can forgive sins the way that priests can, because they're connected to heaven in the temple. And so this is looking ahead to a theme that's about to be developed and accelerated in the next chapter. Now, this is one of the rare passages in John where Jesus is called the Son of Man. And this comes from Daniel. I saw in the night visions, one like the Son of Man came to the Ancient of Days, and he received authority and dominion and a kingdom over all the earth. Now, the Son of Man's ascension from earth to heaven in Daniel chapter 7, he comes from earth on the clouds of heaven, to the Ancient of Days. This is a good title to use here, because if the Son of Man, if Jesus, if he is the ladder connecting heaven and earth, well, we also want to give him the title of the one who goes from earth to heaven. And this notion that Jesus is at one and the same time, he is in heaven, yet he is on the earth through the presence of his Spirit, means we want to go back to the Old Testament and we want to get all these visions and all these titles of figures like the Son of Man in Daniel, who traverse between heaven and earth, or like this ladder in Genesis that connects heaven and earth, because Jesus is the cosmic Christ. He is the gateway through which those on earth can enter into heaven.